Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you, Roger Beckett. I have no intention of running for political office, but in case I change my mind, please don't lose that introduction. I want to thank Dr. Benz and Mr. Porton and Mr. Repka and above all, Bunny White, for your hospitality. It's an honor to be here. I came to this state twice to campaign for the gentleman after whom the Ashbrook scholars revolve. I remember on the first occasion, the other speaker was an aging Hollywood actor. And we know what happened to him. In fact, I heard it said by somebody who was giving a talk in San Diego and was very gloomy about the cultural hegemony of liberalism in Hollywood, who said, yes, it is true, they are all liberals. However, there is a minority, and the good news is that 1 out of 3 Hollywood conservative actors become president. I congratulate you all for perpetuating the memory and the ideals of John Ashbrook, who was a friend of mine and integral to the growth of the conservative movement. The Ashbrook scholars, manifestly on the basis of my brief experience with them, are wonderfully qualified to perpetuate those ideals. So I thank you for associating me with their careers. I have the habit of collecting every few weeks data that interests me and formulating a few propositions. I'd like to try a few of these out on you, I hope wistfully for agreement from some of you with respect to some of them, though I'm reconciled to residual differences. If that happens, it shouldn't worry either of us. I've experienced rejection before, and you've been wrong before. My first proposition is that with the announcement of his health care reforms, we have a sense of what a Clinton presidency foretells in domestic policy. It hasn't been easy to trace the evolution in his thinking as witness the confusion generated by his inaugural address only 10 months ago. The viewer on Inauguration Day was justified, I think, in coming to personal conclusions about the new president. It was, I think, hard to escape the judgment that Mr. Clinton is a mythogenic figure. The energy, the eye for variety, the desire to please, the expressive face that reflects awe and delight, as though every few minutes he were rushing down the stairs to look under the Christmas tree. Even as during his summer vacation at Martha's Vineyard, he treated every day as though it combined the freshness of the first day of Earth with the excitement of the last. But he didn't, so far as one could see, delineate a distinctive political program, as, for instance, FDR had done and Ronald Reagan. Rather, he used metaphors, indeed metaphorical paradoxes. He said he wanted to force the spring, and one gathers warm the winter, cool the summer. These are invitations issued by statesmen on hypnotic highs. And these bring on collisions with reality, as witnessed the president's complaint to 3 carefully selected newsmen a week ago, quote, "I have fought more damn battles here for more things than any president in 20 years and not gotten a damn bit of credit from the knee-jerk liberal press, and I'm sick and tired of it." Viewed in the light of his inaugural address, that explosion is confusing. My second proposition is to the effect that in an attempt to clarify its mission and to describe its constituency, the Clinton movement has arrogated language that is perplexingly used. Mr. Clinton invokes the term idealistic more often than anyone since Robert Kennedy, but how exactly in current political idiom does one define idealistic? Would it be idealistic to send troops into Bosnia to straighten out the awful mess there? The argument can certainly be made. But the younger generation, whose views on the question correspond with Mr. Clinton's, is instructed in these matters by the Vietnam experience, and idealism was then defined as resisting engagement in Vietnam as young Bill Clinton did. The historical result of pulling away from Vietnam, to put it economically, was the boat people. There were many reasons for not wanting to fight in Vietnam, but none of them was idealistic in the conventional sense. So what is it that defines the idealism of the young Clintonites in public policy? Maybe we're talking about the rejection of greed. Greed as in the decade of greed, which refers, of course, to the 80s associated with Ronald Reagan. But Mr. Clinton campaigned on his determination to give more things to more people. He's pledged to renew the infrastructure, to create new jobs, to extend free health care to the uninsured, to increase subsidies for education, and to reduce the national debt. Is the desire for a job an expression of greed? If so, it helps us to understand the decade of greed under Mr. Reagan, during which 19 million new jobs were created. And anyway, isn't it natural to want free health care, or is that greedy? Free health care is health care someone else pays for. Otherwise, health care is something we pay for ourselves, as was the case during the first 180 years of our republic, from which we must deduce that greed was the defining American characteristic up until Medicare. My next proposition is that the Clinton administration appears to ignore the inverse correlation between dependence on the state and personal independence. As one views modern history, one is, I think, tempted to conclude that the safest rule in town is that the greater the role of government, the lesser the role of the citizen. But the old presumption against the nationalization of social problems, which we're now engaged in doing on the matter of health, is pretty sleepy these days, even in Republican bunkers. This is in part because communism and dogmatic socialism tended over the years to monopolize our attention, and they, of course, are bankrupt. American conservatives, it's widely reported, are in anarchic confusion, stranded since the fall of the Berlin Wall without a mobilizing mission. By the way, this is in part true. The enemy is not quite incarnated the way he used to be when we had Hitler and Stalin to kick around, but the forces that contend against conservative and libertarian values are hydra-headed, invincible. Under Marxism, Leninism, they reached a most advanced form. Communism was inhumane, collectivist, Philistine, but when the Soviet Union fell apart, that did not bring an end to inhumanity, collectivism, or Philistinism. These are aspects of the human condition, and although the afflictions are individuated, they gain great component force when they combine in the engine of the state. The individual can be a great wastrel, and the damage is huge, but it is intimate. Whereas the state engaged in dissipation can do to itself what Argentina did in my lifetime. In 1939, Argentina's income per capita exceeded that of France. Argentina is nowadays, after a long generation of populism, near to being a banana republic. Conservatives are concerned for this reason over this evolution of the Clinton phenomenon, which it is now safe to conclude is a statist in character. Speaker Tom Foley was absolutely correct when he said after the passage of the budget bill that this spelled, quotes, an end to the era of Ronald Reagan. The political momentum, most notably in the matter of public health, is once again centripetal, Washington-oriented. This is a pity in the eyes of conservatives, not only because we have known about the perils of centralized government ever since the founding fathers taught us about them, but because providentially, a modern electronic science has revitalized the centrality of the individual. Deregulation was always more merely than an administrative convenience. It is the agent of the adjudications of the marketplace. For many years it was contended that the individual is lost in the great tides of modern commerce, but we learn that this is not so, that science has made the marketplace uniquely responsive. George Gilder put it best when he wrote last December, rather than pushing decisions up through the hierarchy, the power of microelectronics pulls them remorselessly down to the individual. One free mind plus a workstation can outperform any array of regimented minds. But the emphasis is no longer on the individual nor even on the private sector. The indifference to the law of subsidiarity is quite general. That law that specifies that no social task should be assigned to the public sector except after it is established that it cannot be handled by the private sector, and that if one turns to the public sector, it should be always to the lowest echelon of that sector, leaving it for a higher echelon only when the lesser can't handle the problem. None of the candidates in the protracted campaign a year ago suggested that working mothers who had a problem in caring for their children should look to private resources for help, and that only if these fail them should they turn to state governments for help, not the federal government. No, all the talk focuses on what federal program is appropriate. It baffles the mind of the citizen brought up on the doctrine of subsidiarity why Washington, rather than Little Rock, should play the primary role in looking after the working mothers of Arkansas. A corollary of this is that we ignore the entire purpose of our federalist structure, and in doing so we engage in political and physical casuistry. A year ago in May we had the Los Angeles riots. They were for many months, right through the Democratic Convention, a principal concern of the politically minded, and the consensus was that it was a federal responsibility to do something about Los Angeles. Do what? Why, fund its revitalization. But Los Angeles doesn't really need federal funding because California's resources are at parity level. Parity level is here defined as the level at which the median per capita income of the inhabitants of the state is equal to the national median or better. For such states, it doesn't make any sense to look to Washington for money. California sends to Washington $1.20 for every dollar it receives back from Washington, so that to ask Washington for more money for urban problems is in effect to tax Californians a greater sum than California would receive if it financed its own proposals. It is a basic axiom of American economics that with the exception of a few states, Mississippi, West Virginia, money coming in from Washington is the same money that you just finished sending to Washington, where, of course, money spends an expensive night out on the town. What have we achieved through our great centralized federal social projects? Since 1960, we have spent $2.6 trillion on welfare. Things are here and there a little better, and things are here and there a little worse, and here and there a lot worse. As a heritage study revealed late this spring, since 1960, there has been, quotes, a 560% increase in violent crime, more than a 400% increase in illegitimate births, a quadrupling of divorce rates, a tripling in the percentage of children living in single-parent homes, and a drop of 80 points in the SAT scores. My next proposition is that inquisitive social thought is turning more and more to the problem of illegitimacy. The overriding problem of our urban centers is single-parent homes. What is the Clinton administration supposed to do about the awesome rise in illegitimacy? He did not address that question when he last traveled to California a week ago. Yet single-parent families are the preeminent cause of A, poverty, B, illiteracy, C, crime, D, drugs, and E, unemployment. Illegitimacy among whites has risen in percentage points more sharply in the past 20 years than among blacks, from 6 to 17%, i.e. tripled. But among blacks it has risen from 38 to 62%. The composite figure is a rise in illegitimate births from 10 to 30%. Produce one illegitimate child and you contribute statistically to all the above: poverty, literacy, crimes, drugs, and unemployment. Just what are the problems in Los Angeles of those households in which a mother and father are both resident? How might a national ethos be ignited on the subject of single-parent procreation? An attitude has to evolve that begins with solemnizing marriage. Professor James Q. Wilson argues persuasively in his new book, The Moral Sense, that marriage needs indispensably to be one thing: a commitment. It is a commitment that can be waived if in the years ahead intolerably incompatible unions evolve, at which point divorce logically follows. But to begin with less than a commitment is to trivialize whatever else is responsible for the breakup of the family, particularly among black households. It is inescapably the case that the prejudice against religion in education has played a role in this decline. The Playboy philosophy, explicitly regnant in the 60s, appealed to many as the key to hedonism. But hedonism is not the key to happiness. And the wretchedness that blights so many families has much to do with what Richard Newhouse dubbed the nakedness of the public square. In years gone by, there were in every community men and women who spoke the language of duty and morality, of loyalty and obligation. Licentious engagements in hedonism are more readily countered or outgrown in the more disciplined classes. The dissipation of the moral sanction is a casualty of church-state fanaticism. What do the American people want? They want, Professor Wilson plausibly says, they want our leaders, the media, television programs and motion pictures, to take their side in the war over what the family is. It is not one of several alternative lifestyles. It is not an arena in which rights are negotiated. It is not an old-fashioned and reactionary barrier to a promiscuous sex life. It is not a set of cost-benefit calculations. It is a commitment. What is missing with the advent of the illegitimate baby is any coalescing sense of the illegitimization of the child's mother and father. What if the moral sensibilities of the community were to sharpen to the point of causing the community to conclude that unwed father, that unwed mother are irresponsible citizens and selfish human beings, and their self-indulgence, whether that of the ghetto teenager or that of Elizabeth Taylor, should not be celebrated but lamented, because their wantonness and infidelity leave a trail of misery and crime and loneliness and aggression. Senator Moynihan ingeniously noted a few weeks ago how we are being instructed by Emil Durkheim, who concluded that every society needs a certain degree of self-respect, and that therefore when what is conventionally thought of as wrong behavior becomes common, societies tend to respond by, as Moynihan puts it, defining deviancy down. Once upon a time, it was deviant behavior to bear a child out of wedlock. With every third child now illegitimate, it becomes easier to define deviancy down than to re-stimulate the old sanctions, but the victims of society's indifference do not suffer less. The relative inattention given to the rise in single-parent families leads me to the next proposition, which is that Mr. Clinton's social programs spring from misconceptions derived from populist rhetoric. Among these misconceptions is the notion that the Reagan-Bush administrations were primarily vehicles for the accommodation of an affluent class, that government revenue was stifled by Reagan-Bush, and that government programs were starved by Reagan-Bush. Very soon after Mr. Clinton's inauguration, the New York Times published a series of 4 articles by its Washington correspondent David Rosenbaum, giving its readers a comprehensive report on what they call the push and pull over taxes. Deep down the first of these articles, Mr. Rosenbaum wrote, one popular misconception is that the Republican tax cuts caused the crippling federal budget deficit. The fact is, the large deficit resulted because the government vastly increased what it spent each year while tax revenues changed little. He proceeded to give the figures. Well, if it's true that tax revenues didn't diminish under Reagan, what about public spending on the infrastructure? In Newsweek magazine early in March, we read economist Robert Samuelson. Clinton's basic rationale for more government, he wrote, is that investment in America has lagged. Actually, he informs us, that isn't so. Business investment rose over the preceding decade, as did research and development spending, as did government investment. He gave one example. Since 1980, highway spending, adjusted for inflation, has risen about a quarter. Contrary to popular impression, road conditions have gradually improved. Between 1983 and 1991, the share of urban interstate highways rated as poor dropped from 17 to 8%. How was it then that there was so much misinformation abroad? It has to do with what we have heard first from candidate Clinton and then from President Clinton. What makes so many Americans so jittery about Bill Clinton is his manifest appetite for glib falsifications. It really gets bad when, as happened to me in July after hearing the president's speech on the budget bill. I felt that I needed to shut my eyes, recite the multiplication tables, say the alphabet, maybe drop an ashtray on the floor to check out the gravity was still around. Anyone who has respect for the least requirements of formal logic should not declare in one paragraph quotes, no more something for nothing. And at the end of that paragraph, quotes, I'm especially proud that this time the federal government has been fighting alongside the people who suffered from the Mississippi River floods. What goes on here? One, the victims of the flood are getting something for nothing, aren't they? What does Mr. Clinton mean by this time the federal government is getting into the relief business? Who was it helped the victims of the hurricanes in Florida, the earthquake in San Francisco? We've been given the politics of abandonment, the president went on. The listener wonders, what is that, the politics of abandonment? Well, he tells you what he means, right there and then. And the next morning you see it in print and confirm it. After the word abandonment followed cutting taxes on the well-off and asking nothing of them in return, while raising taxes on the middle class to pay for more of the same government. What could he mean by saying that? The basic 1981 law, Kemp-Roth, cut taxes not only on the well-off, but uniformly. The 1982 tax was primarily a tax on corporations. The 1986 tax reduced taxes at all levels, but imposed on the wealthy class the costly forfeiture of traditional shelters. 6 million taxpayers were relieved of any tax whatever. In 1985, the tax code was indexed, relieving the middle class of bumping into higher rates of taxation by inflation. The 1981 and 86 acts were approved by every member of the Senate Finance Committee, with a single exception. And the final vote was overwhelmingly in favor in both houses of Congress, including the affirmative vote of Senator Kennedy. Suddenly we hear all this called the politics of abandonment. We move then to a related proposition, namely that the mystification of these sources of revenue is a necessary stratagem of collectivist policies. We should really stop just long enough to remind ourselves what it is that we are engaged in. It is an attempt at further redistribution. The irony is that redistribution will be from the middle class to the middle class. The upper income class is depleted, and in any case is not freshly singled out, except to the extent that the rich are heavier cigarette smokers than the rest of America, since the only proposed new tax is on tobacco. The poverty class will be looked after by the straightened middle class. What are the basic architectural facts of healthcare? One, if all arrangements affecting healthcare were left, so to speak, in a state of nature, then each of us would pay his own health bills. Two, but health bills can overwhelm personal finances. even as fires can burn down whole houses. For this reason, the idea of insurance arose. People would pay into a pool every year, and when catastrophe struck, draw out from that pool the price of rebuilding your house or your liver. What transpires is that some people can't afford to pay into that pool. Societies that acknowledge a fraternal concern for those who can't pay their own way step in and do it for them. All that was needed in order to reform the health system was to devise a way to look after the health bills of the poor. That task does not overburden the imagination. Instead, we have come up with alliances, health maintenance organizations, combination plans, fluctuating deductibles, under-the-table subsidies, and distinctions between eyeglasses and contact lenses. There are about 12% of Americans whose income is below the poverty level, and yet already, that is to say, pre-Clinton, the United States spends $900 per person below the poverty level for health, which compares with $1,300 per capita above the poverty level. To make up that difference, we're going to reinvent healthcare, leading us to the proposition that the misinformation in which the public has indulged misdirects the vectors of current economic policy as we consider the proposed means of financing the new health package. My proposition is that the issue of fairness, as regularly raised by Mr. Clinton, is economically impoverished and philosophically mischievous. I suspect that what brought the subject to the forefront of public discussion is the publicity given in the last few years to surrealistic executive salaries. Those of you with long memory may remember when, in 1972, presidential candidate George McGovern discovered that the president of the Ford Motor Company was being paid $400,000 per year. His indignation was such that he very nearly asked for a constitutional amendment to make such egregious salaries unlawful. 400 grand back in '72 translates into 1.1 million today. If you were to offer any such sum easy to the top executives of Time Warner, they would look at you and say they don't accept tips. Now, one of Mr. Clinton's reforms is philosophically incomprehensible, but highly illuminating in any attempt to understand Clintonian ideas of fairness. It is that a company may not henceforward deduct as a business expense any salary to an executive officer higher than $1 million. The notion that the company paying its president $2 million is not undergoing a business expense simply defies logic. What is it, if not a business expense? And who is to decide whether it is an expense worth the stockholders' money, the company's stockholders, or 55 million voters acting through Congress? To maintain that a $2 million salary is not a business expense is the equivalent of maintaining that a $2 million helicopter purchased by the government is not a government expense. It may be a dumb government expense, but it is a government expense, period, end argument, and if you disagree, go back to school and relearn the ABCs of logic and of language, and be careful in selecting what school to learn in as Chelsea Clinton. What are we talking about when we talk about fairness? In the past decade, many who were already rich got richer. But the decade was also marked by considerable upward mobility. And it is, I think, worth noting that only 1/2 of the families in the top 1% sector at the beginning of the decade were still there at the end of the decade. Others moved in, which is good to hear about a society that prides itself on opportunity. Is all of this fair? What is fairness? Well, unless you're going to take the position that everybody should earn exactly the same thing, fairness gives way to a democratic instrument called the market. Now, the market can, in the judgment of many who observe its allocations, act idiosyncratically. It is perfectly capable of giving Michael Jackson in 1 week more money than Ludwig van Beethoven earned in a lifetime. The market isn't interested in fairness in the way in which Mr. Clinton uses that word, any more than eugenics is interested in an equal endowment of beauty. The market is interested in faithful transcriptions of economic democracy. What does the voter who puts up his dollar want? Fairness has literally nothing to do with the relative value of one item over another. One economic moralist writing 20 years ago, opined that there should never be a difference of more than 6 times the compensation between the richest and the poorest. That formula rolls trippingly off the tongue and quietens the Jacobinical appetites until someone raises a hand and says, why not make that 5 times? Indeed, why not? On the other hand, why not make it 7 times? And so on. It is in such a season as this that it pays to remind oneself of the postulates of a free society and of a free market society. With respect to the latter, the governing assumption is that unless there is fraud or extortion involved, any exchange of goods produces a profit for both parties. If Jimmy and Jane elect to pay $100 to hear Michael Jackson sing, they have, by their reckoning, improved their lot. They are minus $100, but they are going to spend a night of pleasure listening to Michael Jackson, who will be $100 richer. And they have concluded that they would rather have the evening with Jackson than $100. The same applies in the dizzy heights of economic exchange. The shareholders who authorize a $20 million salary for the services of Bill Gates figure they're better off with Mr. Gates running their affairs than with $20 million extra dollars to distribute in dividends. It would have been worth it to IBM last year to have paid $5 billion to a successful CEO. Now, any given board of directors might be very dumb to believe a CEO is worth $2 million, but that's their problem. And it is because wealthy people make mistakes that 1/2 of those who were in the top 1% 12 years ago no longer are. And then the money the very rich acquire seeks opportunities every day to aggrandize through investments in stocks or bonds, which are instruments through which people are continually exchanging apples for oranges, shoes for shirts, savings for houses, or standby commitments for economic futures that pay off only if one is lucky or astute or both. It really doesn't matter if the top 1%'s holdings appreciate in value. To get there, they are rendering services to those they deal with, ultimately the consumer. We arrive at Governor Clinton's favorite derogation, which is Trickle-Down Economics. He uses this designation as others would use the Teapot Dome scandal or Watergate or Auschwitz. The assumption of trickle-down is, of course, that the rich entrepreneur gets the whole pie, all except for the crumbs that trickle down to the working class. It is, however, difficult to reconcile this view with modern commercial practices. A company that earns 7 or 8% on its gross is considered to be successful and well managed. But this tells us that 92% of the company's gross is going to suppliers, to labor, and to tax collectors. Hardly something that lends itself credibly to the metaphor of trickle-down. And, of course, the philosophical postulate is manageable in a single sentence. After you have paid your taxes, which ought not to be discriminatory, what you have left is yours, not Bill Clinton's, no, not even Mother Teresa's, unless you choose to give it to her. The principal objection to the progressive feature of the income tax is, of course, philosophical. Do we or do we not guarantee equal treatment under the law? We do not if it's okay to tax someone who works 60 hours per week at a higher rate than someone who works 40 hours per week. But the empirical arguments against it are also formidable. Some years ago, at Madison Square Garden, Senator Kennedy made much sport of the statement attributed to Mr. Reagan, namely that the progressive income tax originated with Karl Marx, whereas, said Mr. Kennedy, in fact, it originated with Teddy Roosevelt. In fact, it originated with neither, although its formal promulgation as an instrument of redistribution was first done in the Communist Manifesto of Marx and Engels. It had been proposed on the eve of the French Revolution. But when the idea was brought to the liberal Turgot, his comment was that the author of the idea, not the proposal, should be executed. Leaving to one side the philosophical question, the incandescent fact of the matter is that the higher rates of taxation are glaringly unproductive. During the campaign, before he raised the ante after his election, Governor Clinton proposed to raise the higher tax level to 36% for those earning between $200,000 and $1 million. This would raise $12 billion. And then for those earning over $1 million, a surcharge of 10%. That would raise $10 billion, assuming a static economic situation, or enough to pay federal expenses for 2 days. Since the election, Mr. Clinton raised the ante. The surcharge will now begin at $140,000, And 85% of the top one-half of Social Security payments of those earning $30,000 or more will be taxed, assuming, again, static economic analysis, the increased income tax plus the Social Security tax will raise $30 billion, or enough to pay government costs for 6 days. But economic movement will not be static. One thing is absolutely predictable. It is that under the higher tax rates, by the end of Mr. Clinton's term, revenues from the wealthiest class of Americans will be less than they now are. Between 1978 and 1986, the top tax rates came down 70% to 28%, lowered by Democratic Congresses. The percentage of taxes paid by the top 1% of Americans went up over 50%. When in 1986 the capital gains was raised, tax revenues reduced by 40%. The rich fixation phenomenon, relatively new to America, is a flagrant import from class-conscious Great Britain. 1% of the American people, even before the budget bill, were paying 27% of all federal taxes. 50% of the American people were paying 95% of all taxes. The conclusion is inescapable that the men and women who seek to dominate political fashion in America would rather these people should be taxed at an even higher rate than that the benefit of their industry should inure to growth and stability, and even if the higher tax rate generates reduced revenues. We are, I think, paying an exorbitant price for the pleasure of harassing people who are rich today and people who would like to become rich tomorrow. But tomorrow will, it appears, come now the day after tomorrow, somewhere over the rainbow. And this leads me to my final proposition, which is that it should be our concern to revive the ideal of the democratic voter. I'd like to see a heavy emphasis placed on what one might call the ethos of the commonweal. It's not everywhere acknowledged, or for that matter known, that John Stuart Mill, the great bard of the universal franchise, qualified his enthusiasm for the vote by saying that, of course, he would never expect that anyone would vote who did not take into account his primary duty to the commonweal. Everyone, I think, has a stake in vitalizing the taboos against narrow, self-interested voting as an acceptable substitute for conscientiously searching out and voting for the best interests of the republic. How to forward the prospects of these goals by institutional reforms? The most obvious measure has to do with term limitation, surely. The knowledge that one's tour duty, like that of Cincinnatus, will be limited, encourages a vote for the strategic interests of the republic rather than the narrower interests of a constituency expected to send a legislator back to Washington for the rest of his life. We should, I think, also discourage the vote of the rawly ignorant and apathetic. A momentum was built up after the war that ended up giving the vote to 18-year-olds. To the surprise of the principal sponsors of that vote, the majority of the new voters, 18 to 21, voted Republican. Accordingly, the vote seekers went further, and now they passed a law that you could vote even if you could not read or write. Never mind read or write in English, read or write in any language. We are told by Senator Bill Bradley, one of whose committees recently looked into the matter of juvenile literacy, that 1/4 of the college freshmen in Dallas, Texas, do not know the name of the foreign country south of the border. If this is so, then surely we should not object to that quarter of the college population of Texas being discouraged from voting in general elections, pending their introduction to the existence of the Republic of Mexico and perhaps graduate training as to its location. It's one thing to be born with the absolute right to the protection of the laws from infancy to the grave. That right belongs to us all, including the deaf, dumb, and blind. It is something else to assume that mere birth in America qualifies everyone to define the laws that govern us. There has been much commotion in the land over the question of education. The cause of this has got to be the inexplicable polarization between the money spent on education and the results achieved. 25% of U.S. high school seniors identify Franklin Delano Roosevelt as the man who was president during the Vietnam War. 3/4 don't know what Reconstruction was, and my favorite, 2/3 can't place the Civil War within 50 years of when it took place. That means 2/3 of all young adults figure the Civil War happened sometime before 1814 or sometime after 1914. So what? So what does that have to do with wages, wine, women, and song? One young person, questioned by Mike Wallace on 60 Minutes, wondered out loud just why he should care to learn anything. The question is so majestic in its effrontery, one pauses breathless to answer it. Well, it isn't hard to answer the petitioner's question if he's talking purely about instrumental knowledge. You can't carry a heavy load of material from one end of your yard to the other unless you know the uses of a wheel. You can't become a plumber without learning the tools of the plumber's trade. But a plumber, we are hearing it said in effect, need not know the difference between the Civil War and the Peloponnesian War, or even which came first. As a matter of fact, a senator doesn't absolutely need to know. In 1950, 84% of high school seniors knew that Manila was the capital of the Philippines. In 1984, only 27% knew this. There is no way to face such evidence other than to say that the American educational establishment is getting worse. Is it a question of money? The highest SAT scores in the nation last year were earned by Iowa, North Dakota, South Dakota, Utah, and Minnesota. In dollars per student spent, these states came in respectively 27th, 44th, 42nd, and 51st. So that the correlation of the education lobby, or money, is less certain than a state's proximity to Canada, as Senator Moynihan pointed out. Well, allocate the blame here and there in any way you want on television, slothful parents, lazy children. Still, the teachers are there to teach. And of course, the difficulty in answering the question, why should I know when there was a civil war, is a part of that ignorance the teachers have not succeeded in coping with. A student or an adult is not required to establish a rational edifice on the basis of which learning is justified. But if he cannot do this, he must accept the postulates of civilized society, and these are that learning is desirable and that democracy without learning is difficult to defend, inasmuch as the epistemological burden of democracy is carried on the citizens' shoulders. And yet it does matter enormously whether at top-ranking educational institutions the raw grammar of history, philosophy, and literature can be ignored. We indict not only our educational institutions, but also democracy. Mine is hardly an appeal to voting only by the educated elite. Many years ago, I affirmed that, to quote myself, I would sooner be governed by the first 2,000 names in the Boston telephone book than by the faculty of Harvard. And I reiterate this preference. Among the 2,000 Boston telephone users, there will be perhaps 100 who've never heard of Mexico. But among 2,000 PhDs, there will be 500 who will vote for utopia. And the search for utopia was marked during the century by enthusiasm for fascism and communism. Utopias never come, but omnipotent government is everywhere about us. I conclude this set of observations based on emanations from the new administration with just a tremor of optimism, nicely intimated in a legend framed in the office of Mr. Nixon's Secretary of the Treasury, William Simon. It read, "You can fool some of the people all the time, and all the people some of the time, and those are pretty good odds." Yes, but we are left with that little Lincolnian window that reassures us that you can't fool all the people all the time. It is my sense of it that notwithstanding his now legendary reversals last spring, which brought his popularity rating to a historic low, Bill Clinton has the most saleable political personality since JFK. He gives the impression of a total immersion in the problems of everybody, as though he had just risen from a Baptist initiation, water coming out of every one of his pores, designed to wash away the problems of industrial workers, farmers, merchants, shipbuilders, gays, deficit watchers, the sick, the halt, the lame. The impression works miracles on television, as witness his great coup with the kids in the White House back in February, you may remember. The viewer would not have been surprised if at the end of the hour Bill Clinton had officially adopted all 40 of them, giving them quarters in the White House and all those rooms emptied by his economy drive. There is, of course, the difficulty a growing number of observers are pointing to, however reluctantly. It is the encroaching sense of the great con. We have, for instance, Mr. Clinton's propensity for utter confusion with numbers. When during the campaign the Bush people took the figures from Clinton's speeches and said, this looks to us like higher taxes not just for people making $200,000 per year, but for people making $60,000, Mr. Stephanopoulos, Clinton's running emollient, was there simply to laugh away with the highest pitch of disdain the terrible exaggerations of the Republican critics. But it turned out the Republicans underrated the incidence of higher taxes, which will be paid by people earning $20,000 or more per year. Then there is that rich vein of disingenuousness, when suddenly a new tax gets spoken of as a reduction in government spending. If 85% of Social Security dividends are going to be taxed from now on, then X billion dollars less in Social Security payments are going to go from Washington to American citizens. Run that through the Clinton Newspeak machine, and we're told not that there's going to be a tax increase, but there's going to be a reduction in federal expenses. Think for one moment if that maneuver had been tried by Tricky Dick. He'd have been run out of town with wet towels. Now, it's just possible that the Boy Scout do-goodness of the Clinton persona will continue to make all of the above progressively invisible. The regulation-choking high taxes, corporation-mangling, dollar-finagling recedes from view under the transmutations of the big smile, the bear hug, the hydra-handed handshakes, the electric blanket warmth, the wall-to-wall goodness. But it's also possible that there's a hard, inquisitive intelligence out there among the American people who will recognize that the American people aren't getting any real benefit from all this commotion, just a lot more government. And that a year or two from now, the ebullience will suddenly stop working for him as reality creeps in like ironweed, gradually isolating the big omni-concerned, omnidirectional globalist welfare center hunkered down at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, causing the people to say simply, go home, please. There's always a great deal to do to guard our liberty. Thomas Jefferson, we like to think, went a little too far when he suggested that once in every generation, in order to keep our liberty, we should expect, as he put it, to water the land with the blood of tyrants and martyrs. But he had a lively point. The government, he said, can only do something for the people in proportion as it can do something to the people. And the government every season is preparing to do more and more for the people, discouraging. But when gloom threatens, and like Ishmael, we find ourselves tempted to make up the tail end of funeral processions, we need to reflect on the singular blessings of life in America. It repays us to recall that since the end of World War II, the world has seen 80 wars resulting in 30 million deaths. That according to the most recent listing of the New York Times in midsummer, there is civil war as we speak here tonight in Angola, Chad, Djibouti, Ethiopia, Liberia, Rwanda, Somalia, Sudan, Western Sahara, Zaire, Colombia, Guatemala, Peru, Afghanistan, Kashmir, Myanmar, the Philippines, Indonesia, Sri Lanka, Northern Ireland, Bosnia, Croatia, Serbia, Iraq, Palestine, Lebanon, Turkey, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Tajikistan, and Moldova. In Great Britain, such is the general demoralization that 49% of the population, according to a poll taken early in March, would leave the country if they could do so. There is no such wave of emigration from the United States, because for all our failings, what the British historian observed over a century ago is still, I think, true. The land is bright. We can best express our gratitude for our patrimony by endeavoring to preserve it, to fight for our liberal institutions, to pledge ourselves to their survival, and to thank God always for his singular benefactions, which include the fortitude to survive electoral vicissitudes.
So you think that shouldn't Congress take a greater responsibility in the financial management of the country?
Well, actually, it wasn't quite as you said, because as a percentage of the gross national income, Graham-Rudman began to do its job in 1985, 86, and 87. It was after its replacement and with the 1990 business that the deficit continued to mount, it is, of course, a dismaying question: why on earth is it permitted? Mr. Rudman, when he left the Senate in disgust last year, said at the rate at which we're going by the year 2000, the disposable income from all of our taxes by Congress will be 3%. Entitlements already eat up about 70%. So what should be done about it? Well, it seems to me what should be done about it is really quite plain. There should be a line item veto for the president, and there should be a constitutional amendment. There is, curiously, more interest in the constitutional amendment right now than there was during the Reagan years. He consistently came out for it. Maybe the reason for this interest is the unfailing attraction given to the idea of term limitation. It's lost only in 1 out of 5 state experiments. So it may be that the hot breath of displeasure by people like you is being felt by people who are taking these measures. An extremely important reform, largely under the party of the Wall Street Journal, was passed a couple of months ago. It was the reform that exposed the names of people who were petitioning for a vote on a particular measure. Up until that reform, you could publicly say that you were in favor of calling this economy move up for a general vote. In fact, never having signed the petition asking for that recall. That now is ended. So there is more exposure of the people who are manifestly unconcerned about the deficit. It is a critical question and the ultimate challenge to self-government. Well, I'm against it. I'm against higher taxes. And if you're talking about the budget reconciliation bill that was just passed, I think it wrong for the reasons outlined, i.e. it's not going to raise a lot of money. It's going to reorient savings in a way that are keyed to minimizing exposure to taxes rather than to maximizing production. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry, I misunderstood that, yeah. This is the point that Milton Friedman points out, that there's hardly any point in calling for a balanced budget if all taxes are going to rise. He believes that there ought to be some ceiling to the percentage of the money spent through the public sector. As you know, for years and years and years, it was 19.5, but it's now about 23.5, 23.6, edging up towards 25 when income reduces, as it did during the past recession. Colin Clark, the Australian economist, published a paper in 1945 in which, after very carefully transcribing the economic performance of the industrial countries during the last 50 years, generalized that any country that spends more than 25% through the public sector is actually damaging the wellsprings of its economic future. He got a letter from John Maynard Keynes telling him that he found this extremely persuasive. Maynard Keynes died a few months later, perhaps of a shock over what he had written. But I've always thought of that as a hallmark. People don't exactly know how much the public sector is spending right now. Milton Friedman says he thinks he could establish as 42%, including states and cities. But nobody doubts that the federal government is up very close to 25%. When Taft ran for re-election to the Senate in 1950 here in Ohio, he made that the hallmark of his economic campaign, that all government spending should never exceed 25% of the income. During the war, we spent 29% World War II. Nobody disputes that we're spending at least 39% now, so that we are well past that important line described by Professor Clark.
Well, thank you, Mr. Buckley, for spending this evening with us. And